We're now going to have some conversation. We're running a little tight on time, and so I'm actually going to make a suggestion, and we'll take a quick vote, which is that we go straight to conversing with each other instead of the 5-minute response.
Like it.
And I'm going to interrupt anybody that goes too long. We're good.
Good for you.
Okay. And so I'll just start. Who wants to begin by asking something or conversing about your little topics? Go for it.
Rabbi?
You had said you're interested.
Oh my God, I got a lot of questions for you. Okay, so actually, your summation of the man-God relationship that you talked about was really interesting because it showed to me how vividly different our approach and our understanding of those same figures are. Abraham, Noah, for instance, Moses especially even, and their relationship with God. So we view, for instance, Abraham as someone incredibly submissive. And actually in Islamic sacred text, he's actually considered the role model of submission. And so in one interpretation of one of the passages of the Quran, هُوَ سَمَّاكُمُ الْمُسْلِمِينَ, God named you Muslims, is also interpreted as Abraham is the one that actually named his following Muslims, the ones who give in. إِذْ قَالَ لَهُ رَبُّهُ أَسْلِمْ أَسْلَمْتُ لِرَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Whenever his Lord said to him, submit, he submitted himself. And usually in the Arabic language, when you, and I'm almost done with my question, when you add a preposition, when God said to him this, then he did this, right? The word then is removed, even though it's expected from the rhetorical point of view, to suggest that he complied immediately. Like there wasn't even a back and forth. Not even a little bit, not even a delay between the instruction and the submission to that instruction, right? So I was really, almost, I'll be honest with you, shocked to hear your perspective about the debate between him and God and going back and forth, because we absolutely have no such thing in our religion, especially about Abraham. And actually, we believe that that sort of a thing would actually be tantamount to blasphemy. And God gets corrected, God changes his mind, the all-knowing being, the one full of wisdom. And I know you gave the nuance at the end about, it's like training his children sort of thing. But we certainly don't have that perspective. So I'd like to have you elaborate that further so I make sure I understand your perspective properly. Yeah.
So let me just make sure that I understood. Am I heard?
Yeah.
You're talking about which specific biblical incident?
Your mic's not on. I'm going to get that for you.
Yeah, there's it.
I have a degree in this. Yep.
Now I'm heard?
Nope. Wait a second.
There's the thing on the switch on the top.
On the top.
Is it on mute?
It's on.
Yep, you're good.
You're good.
I'm heard.
You are heard.
So I want to clarify, I want to understand. Tell me the biblical incident that you're referring to.
Okay, so the angels coming, or the commandment coming that the nation of Lot, of Sodom and Gomorrah, are going to be destroyed. Right in the back and forth between him and God. Now we have that conversation, but a very different version of that conversation, where Abraham is pleading with the angels that came to visit him to congratulate him of a child that's coming, and him pleading with them about, Inna fiha Lutan, Lot is in there. Lot is in there. And the angels say to him, we know who's in there, and we're going to save his family. And then the passage transitions over.
Okay.
You know?
So, indeed, first of all, our version of Scripture has Abraham absolutely protesting against God.
Okay.
In the Hebrew, it says that Abraham reacts to hearing what God is going to do, and he says, "Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat," the judge of all the world will not do justice. In other words, God, what I just heard from you, that is not just. And again, as I said, it doesn't say specifically in the text explicitly that God was testing Abraham, but that seems to be the implication, that God told Abraham what he's going to do so that Abraham would have the opportunity, the opening to protest. And when he protests, God seems to be happy. Abraham passed the test. Because now we see that the man who is supposed to bring mercy and justice to the world, has a conscience of justice and morality, and God was testing him by saying, I'm going to destroy the cities in an unjust fashion. Abraham has the sense of justice and has enough of a sense of personal confidence to stand up and speak. On the other hand, as I mentioned, we have the story of God commanding Abraham to sacrifice his son. And in that story, Abraham doesn't protest, and doesn't stand up on his hind legs and say, how could that be? But he just goes immediately and does what he's told, and there the text makes clear how difficult this is and how it goes against Abraham's expectations and moral conscience, and nevertheless he does it. In other words, we have here two stories that seem to contradict themselves, as far as not as far as their content, but as far as their message. And that is the tension. It looks like the scriptures want to create that tension. So we really end up asking ourselves, is Judaism all about submission, or is it all about the exercising of the individual moral conscience? And that leads to everything I talked about. But that tension is absolutely meant to be there. And that, I guess, tension is what gives birth to the metaphor I used of God wanting his children to grow up and mature. According to that, I would say that the story of the sacrifice of the son, in which Abraham is obedient, that is a model for us when we are young children in our religious sense, not in a physical sense. But when we are more mature children, we understand that our Father wants us to grow up, which means not to leave Father behind, not to leave, God forbid, his values behind, but to understand that he wants us to apply in our lives those values that he's given us, apply them in a fashion that perhaps he himself wouldn't even have had in mind.
I'm interested.
Yeah, I'm finished.
Newman, because you talked about it being pulled from our mother's wombs,
Yeah.
and then remaining in that state. Is that what I heard you
Yeah,
say?
and-
How do you respond to what
So
God
actually, I
said?
had a follow-up question with you, just simply about Abraham, and I want to talk about what you just said also, and that is that isn't the incident of Abraham sacrificing the son a lot later than compared to the earlier story of the back and forth with the nation of Lot, because that also coincides with the congratulations of the child.
Right. I wasn't saying that
Right, so
there's a
the reason
progression in the life of Abraham. I wasn't saying that.
Yeah, but I'm saying though that if the idea of progression or maturing, if that metaphor was to stick, if you will, then as he grew older and as he experienced more, you should see more rebuttal. Right, and here you are, one of his greatest tests, and much later in life, and you're finding himself in absolute submission, even from your...
Right, yeah, I wasn't talking about the development of his personality or his religious struggle. I was simply saying those two incidents, being there as raw materials in the scripture, are later in Jewish tradition given relative weight. And of course, they could have been weighted differently. Yeah. And also, of course, I have to admit that I am, in my own interpretation, favoring certain interpretations over other interpretations. Right? I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation that there certainly are those in the Jewish community who we tend to call ultra-Orthodox, that put all their marbles in the basket of complete and utter submission and tend to downplay the sources of autonomy.
Well, I was asking, do you want to weigh in with any of the Christian perspectives on those particular stories?
Not on your life.
Okay. maybe we can move on then to another aspect of the conversation.
Can I bounce
Please do.
go back to the notion, because I'm intrigued. There's this really popular book on knowing the will of God, which is kind of parallel to this, and how does conscience fit into that? In this very popular book in the Christian community, it talks about a wisdom approach, which is identical, Hanan, to what you said about maturation, that the author talks about in the scriptures. There is evidence of inspired ambiguity, that God deliberately leaves some things vague because God wants us to grow up. He wants us to move out of maturity. The metaphor being of a parent. When my children are young, I tell them when they go to bed and what they eat and pretty much govern their lives. My son is 24 and I can't tell him anything anymore. And my daughter is 30 and has her own family. And so now my relationship, my authority with them is different than it was as a child. And so using that metaphor, what I heard you say, Newman, is that the notion of being pulled from the womb and that we remain in that state, the state
relative to the knowledge of God. So it's a relative statement, and knowledge is something that's glorified in our religion quite a bit. So is, as I was mentioning, reflection. Now, the idea of leaving things to interpretation and to reflection is a big component of our religion, and the Quran actually employs quite a bit of that. I mean, it does speak, for instance, it leaves some things out on purpose for you to fill in the blanks, and a lot of historical accounts are mentioned in this way. A lot of times the subject matter, the way even in which it flows, it transitions from one to another, and interpreters grapple over the wisdom behind the transition from one area of study to or one subject matter to another. Now, as far as the relationship comparison of parent and child, we actually avoid that metaphor entirely. We actually have the metaphor of merciful, loving, caretaking, master, and us subservient, loving slaves. And now that seems like an oxymoron because you don't really associate slaves with love, or willingness, right? But there's the texts of Islam basically lead us to this. We don't have to have a metaphor for it. We actually have a very direct, explicit explanation of this relationship, which essentially is accept God as your loving master and accept Him and accept His verdict and His wisdom as ultimate, though you will have to engage in your best, in the best interpretation, honestly, that you can to reach that conclusion. Now, just to talk about the limitations of knowledge just a little bit. So we believe, for instance, that angels are far more knowledgeable than we are because they're creatures of the unseen and they're in the, they're in the seventh heaven, and they're all this tenure, if you will, even before human beings. And God is about to create Adam, and even some angels question in the Quran, you're creating this creature that's going to spill blood. So clearly they're creatures of insight, and they kind of knew what they were talking about. So they said you're going to create this creature that spills blood. And when he does create Adam and he teaches them names of things and he says them, interesting statement that the angels make in unison in the Quran. رَبَّنَا لَا عِلْمَ لَنَا. Master, we have no knowledge whatsoever. إِلَّا مَا عَلَّمْتَنَا, except what you taught us. So the scope of our knowledge is very limited to what you've given us, right? And that's really the expression of the child coming out of the womb that I was talking about. We don't have anything more than what God has given us, and we have to work within that limited framework and trust Him with the rest.
Yes. Sorry. May I ask a question?
Sure.
That's related to this. One of the common themes that I'm hearing in all three of the talks is the difference between the application of what one would call general broad moral principles and the places in which the scriptures for all three mention rather specific behaviors. So
Right.
I'll ask you first, but
Sure.
I know that there's a current within contemporary Islamic thought of the idea that the broad moral principles that are found in the 2/3 of the Meccan surahs should be seen to override specific commands from the Medinan period if there is a conflict between the general principle and the specific command, or an apparent conflict. Let me put it that way. I don't think any Muslim would say there's an actual conflict. So I'm curious, that's one way, and I wonder what you think about that, and what are the other ways in which we nuance this idea between the general principle and specific commands?
Sure. So the specific commands, let's just call them law.
Yeah, the laws.
Now, this contemporary current, whatever I've read on this current, and I'm familiar with it, is actually not very rooted in traditional research. Okay. This matter has extensively been discussed in Islamic history, especially by scholars of law and scholars of religious interpretation. And the principle that's been drawn at the end of the day is that the specific acts or specific commandments that are in the later revelation, the Madani revelation, you can essentially boil them down to one of a few categories. They may have to do with personal commitment, personal finance, personal family law, personal matters, and they can be societal issues like military principles or principles of engagement in war and things like that. It could deal with collective law, if you will, right? And the idea of applicability isn't that we pitch or we place the earlier text and sort of grapple it against the later text, because they're not actually seen in contradiction with each other traditionally. What they're seen as is that here are the nuanced circumstances where this and this and this may not apply, or here are the limited circumstances where these particular laws apply, and here are the laws that are across the board universal except for a few restrictions. So there's two views of laws. One is that they have very specific circumstances in which they're applicable. There's certain laws that are looked at that way. So they're not, you can't just read something in the Quran and say, I know what to do now. Because you're going to find, I'm not going to hide it from you guys, you're going to find, kill them wherever you find them. I'm not going to read that one morning and say, hey, I'm just going to go over to my neighbor's house and apply the Quran now. It doesn't work like that, right? So there is a contextual study of those verses in that passage and how it applies to society. On the other hand, there are laws that are deemed universally applicable with very specific, okay, so does it apply to me too because I'm pregnant, or does it apply to me too because I'm sick, or does it apply to me too, like fasting, for instance, right? Fasting in the month of Ramadan is a religious obligation on every Muslim. But what about those that are sick, or those that are not just sick, seasonally, but they've got a chronic disease, or they're terminally ill, or they're pregnant, or something like that, some other issue, right? Or they're diabetic and they have to take their insulin shot or something like that, right? So there are exceptions made to that, and it's not necessarily looked at as, let's look at the overarching moral principles, and let's then wash out some of the law. It just wasn't the traditional approach at all, yeah.
St. Augustine said, from the Christian tradition, St. Augustine said, and it sounds scandalous the first time you hear it, love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then do as you please, as a moral command. Now, the principle there is that if we love God, if we're relationally in love with God, heart, soul, mind, and strength, then what are we going to please? What are we going to desire? What are we going to want? It seems to me that that's the general principle that
Right.
governs all of, in the Christian tradition, that then governs all of the lesser acts. The summary of the law, Jesus is asked to summarize the Hebrew Scriptures, the law and the prophets, and he says, love God with heart, soul, mind, strength, love neighbor himself, drawn from Hebrew Scriptures, obviously. But I think it's the principle of love that is the general rule, or the general principle that everything else then gets subsumed under.
Sure. I would even add that in Islamic discourse, there's actually a really strong warning against an emphasis on law that is like abiding by the law that is soulless in nature. So only a skeleton of submission remains, and there's actually no spirit driving it. And of course, the extreme reaction to that is let's only concern ourselves with the spiritual, and let's not worry about the outwardly manifestation of the law because it's superficial anyway. Actually, we say that the interior of this building and its exterior are critical, and they have to work together. So,
yes,
to comment on something?
just add, please.
I want to kind of throw out an intuition that's developing in reaction and see how you react. In the Jewish tradition, at least the way I presented it, there is a great theoretical emphasis on autonomy, as we talked about. Not, of course, at the expense of the heteronomy, but in addition. That's in a theoretical sense. Abraham, at the incident of the destruction of the cities in Sodom and Gomorrah, he protests. I gave all the other instances of protest. I talked about how we value so much creative interpretation, etc., etc., etc. That's on the level of theory and philosophy. On the level of practical nuts and bolts, it sounds like, from what I hear, I'm comparing myself to what I heard from you, that Judaism has much more of an emphasis on practical obedience to the law in a day-to-day sense. So what I'm trying to say is that on the level of theory, you're emphasizing you're astounded at how Judaism is so rebellious against God. On the level of theory, Islam sounds to be about submission, and Judaism sounds like it's about creativity. On the level of practical, it's just the opposite, it sounds like to me. Practical day-to-day, you talked about the concepts very similar to what Doug talked about the intuition that comes from being a servant of God that allows you to intuit without looking at the law codes. Whereas for a Jew, the day-to-day life is all about looking at the law code.
Okay.
I'm just trying, how do you react to what I see as a certain paradox or a certain tension between the theoretical and the practical?
Okay, so we look at Islamic law essentially as a set of very limited restrictions. And if you can understand and appreciate those restrictions, and of course on top of that add a very small limited set of dues, really. Not an extensive set of dues, but a limited set of dues. If you understand them, then you have really a free reign in a lot of things. And if you're not sure about something, then you go resort back to the text and, or to scholarship and find out about it. But essentially, for the most part, we have these guiding principles of do's and don'ts are actually pretty good boundaries for the Muslims. So we don't have to actually worry about what does the book say about, just every nuanced detail in the day, but pretty major stuff. Now, when it comes to intricate details in Islam, it actually more has to do with ritual worship than anything else. Special days of worship, the what invalidates somebody's fast, or the proper way to pray and performing the pilgrimage. And there you may have an extensive and a nuanced set of intricacies that one has to really take into consideration to do the acts of worship properly and to give them their justice and to do them as closely as the Prophet himself would do them. May peace and blessings of God be upon him. But as far as the day-to-day guidelines, like driving to work, for example, and let's stick to the example of driving to work. I don't need to consult Sharia for driving to work. All I need to do, though, is, Islam will expect from me to show courtesy to others on the road. That's a moral principle, so I don't know if I should be cutting people off. And I don't need a fatwa from a sheikh to not do that. I should probably indicate before I take a left turn or right turn or something, and not speed. And even that actually speaks to my moral conscience, because the Quran says, generally speaking, awfu bil uqud, fulfill binding contracts. And when I got that license and I signed that paper, even though I didn't read the fine print, I'm pretty sure it said don't speed and don't break traffic laws, etc. Right? Stop at a stop sign even if there's no police officer or camera there. Right? So that becomes it's a moral obligation driven by the overarching principle: abide by binding agreements, live by your binding agreements. So that's really how I see the application of Islam on a daily basis.
I'm going to suggest that we move to having a few questions from the audience. Our microphone seems to have rolled under the altar.
Look at this one. I found you one.
Oh, there it is.
Especially for you.
I'm going to come down here.
Okay.
So we're going to do it this way. I see 1, 2. We got time for 3 or 4 questions, 3 in the very back, and we'll go 1, 2, 3. I'm going to ask you to say your question clearly and loudly, and we'll make sure this is on. It's not. Okay, slowly. It's going to come on.
Thank you for hosting this tonight. I have a reflection in the question of the maturation. I'd like to say that in my personal practice, my complete and joyful submission is more my adult-like attitude, whereas my protesting, to commandments, especially when it comes to self-indulgence or matters of community building, would be the childlike attitude. And then also a question for the Reverend. So if a modern Christian layperson doesn't have the historical body of knowledge, or perhaps lacks the understanding of the language of the Gospels as they were revealed, how do they make a valid and accurate interpretation for themselves?
Nobody is born knowing New Testament Greek. Nobody's born unless you're a New Testament Greek. You have to study it. So we'd send them to a library. We would send them to a library where you can access information about the grammar, the language of the New Testament. You can study the culture. You can study context. Nobody's born innately with that knowledge. Today we all have to study it, and so the command to study to show yourself approved is one of the things that we find in the New Testament. Well, part of the mandate of proper interpretation or faithful interpretation is to avail yourself as a student of those resources that introduce you to those things. And so it's not an instinctive process, it is a learned process. And so we would quite literally send you to a library, give you resources. We would place resources in your hand.